Are there any questions? And I give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister yesterday claimed that Israel, in carrying out its defensive war against terror group Hamas, is breaching international law and should undertake a ceasefire. Is this the government's position?
Call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The transcript of yesterday's interview showed that she did not say that. What the Foreign Minister spoke about was perfectly consistent with the motion that was moved in this parliament that was supported by the opposition on the floor of this parliament, that indeed we continue to support. I think it provides a principled way of moving forward. It provided for one, unequivocally condemns the attacks on Israel by Hamas. It asserted Israel's right to defend itself. It also called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. It condemned anti-Semitism. It went on to say, to recognise that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people nor their needs and aspirations. It acknowledged the devastating loss of Israeli and Palestinian life and the innocent civilians on all sides are suffering as a result of the attacks by Hamas and the subsequent conflict. It said that this parliament supports justice and freedom for Israelis and Palestinians alike. It said, which was backed up by the Foreign Minister yesterday, reiterates Australia's consistent position in all contexts is to call for the protection of civilian lives.
The Prime Minister will pause. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, on relevance, the question didn't relate to a motion before the House. It related to reckless comments by the Foreign Minister yesterday, and the question was, is this the government's position? Can the Prime Minister provide a straight answer?
Order. Resume your seat. The Prime Minister was asked about the government's position. He is reading the government resolutions of the House. He's being relevant to the question, and he's also dealt with the issue of the comments being made in the question as well. The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker. It reiterates Australia's consistent position in all contexts is to call for the protection of civilian lives and the observance of international law. Now, the opposition voted for that a few weeks ago. Is that now not their position? Isn't that not their position now? It acknowledged what has unfolded is deeply distressing for many in the Australian community. It condemned all forms of hate speech. The position on the Middle East is a complex one and one that we know is causing great distress for Jewish Australians, for Palestinian Australians and for people of Islamic faith as well. We know that we have a responsibility to not seek to politicise these matters, but to engage in a principled way going forward. I condemn unequivocally as well the decision by some to have a demonstration in Caulfield on Friday night, as I condemn unequivocally the decision to ride motorbikes through the eastern suburbs of Sydney. That sort of provocation, it is vital at this time that people in positions of leadership exercise that leadership in a responsible way.
Order.
And seek
Prime
to bring
Minister's
people
time
together.
has concluded. Give the call to the member for Jagga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Government Services. How is the Albanese Labor government formally responding to the Royal Commission into the Robodebt scheme, and how does this compare with other responses to the Royal Commission?
Give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Australian Services.
Thank you. Today, the Albanese government has formally responded to all 56 recommendations of the Robodebt Royal Commission. Robodebt, as members of the House will know, was a cruel and crude mechanism. It was neither fair nor legal. It made many people feel like criminals. It was costly in both human and economic terms. So today the Albanese government says never again. We've already ceased the use of debt collection agencies for debt recovery and Services Australia. We've stopped the reverse onus of proof, We've stopped treating people who use our social security safety net as second-class cheats. And last week we announced 3,000 new jobs in the front line of Services Australia to help people process their claims and calls. But we can say never again. But Australians can't have true robo-justice until the opposition join us in a full-throated apology. Now, to be fair, some in the opposition have shown courage. The member for Menzies said, as someone who's a Liberal and believes in the sanctity of the individual, due process and the presumption of innocence, it offended all of these. It was illiberal, it reversed the onus and it hurt people. The member for Flinders has said it's now apparent that the expanded compliance system, now known as Robodebt, is one of the poorest chapters in Australia's public policy history and one that sits at the feet of the coalition in its time of government. Senator Patterson said, it's incredibly regrettable, it should not have happened. We have to learn these lessons. It was the government that I was a member of and I really regret that it happened. But so far, the Leader of the Opposition has not taken the high road, as some of his colleagues had, but rather last August took the low road and accused the Royal Commission of morphing into a witch hunt. The victims of Robodebt have noticed the truculent refusal, the deafening silence of a full-throated apology by the Leader of the Opposition. You cannot have justice for Australians, the promise that never again will it occur, when the potential alternative government doesn't own the problem. You cannot have justice for the victims unless there's a guarantee that it won't be repeated again and that the lessons have been learned. However, the Leader of the Opposition so far has given no sign of fully owning the disaster which was Robodebt. We all know the difference between a standard politician's apology, if you are offended, I'm sorry, and a real one. So it's time, Member for Dixon, it's time for a real apology today in the parliament, right here, right now. Copy your courageous backbenchers, own the sins of the coalition and stop airbrushing history.
And call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister.
Order. Members on my right. The Leader of the Opposition will begin his question again in silence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Over the last 15 months, the cost of everything has gone up under this Prime Minister. The latest CPI data shows that food is up 8.2%, housing costs 10.4%, insurance is up 17.3%, electricity up 18.2%, and gas is up by a massive 28%. The Prime Minister has broken every promise made before the election and made poor decisions every day since. Why are Australians paying the price for a distracted and out-of-touch Prime Minister failing to focus on the real issues affecting Australians?
Order. The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question once again, showing that he has absolutely nothing positive to offer the Australian people. Absolutely nothing. Because there are three vital ways that we're tackling cost of living. Getting costs down for families, getting wages up for workers and getting the budget onto a stronger foundation. And on all of those measures, those opposite oppose everything positive that is put forward in this parliament. He has nothing positive to offer the country. He just says no to everything that is put forward, opposes change and can't even lead his own party. He can't even appoint a shadow minister for Stuart Robert, who resigned about 5 months ago, because he's hampered by those people on his backbench. Now, despite the opposition of those opposite, we've delivered $23 billion in cost of living relief to Australians. $23 billion. Cheaper childcare, which began in July. More Medicare bulk billing that began just this month, with a tripling of the bulk billing incentive. Cheaper medicines on January 1, and then again the 60-day dispensing. This is the first question. This is the first question on cost of living we've had for them for months. For months. Jim Chalmers doesn't have to worry about not being here because he won't get a question as the Treasurer. We had the energy bill relief
Members on my
that
left.
we put together with states and territories last year, opposed by those opposite. Fee-free TAFE training, over 220,000 places, making a difference for free. The building more affordable homes, again opposed by those opposite. Just like they oppose our actions that have got wages growing at the fastest rate in a decade. Just like they opposed the pay rise for aged care workers of 15%. Just like they said an increase in the minimum wage would lead to the whole economy collapsing. We've created 550,000 jobs since we came to office. The more jobs created on our watch than under any first-term government in Australia's history, and we're not even halfway through. And we did something those opposite never did. We turned a $78 billion deficit into a $22 billion surplus.
Order. There is far too much noise on my left. The member for Bowman, Barker and Groom will cease interjecting. The call to the member for Aston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What did the Royal Commission find about the robo-debt scheme, and how does this government's approach to helping vulnerable Australians differ?
The call to the order. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Aston for her question, and note that she's the best member for Aston we've had for some time in this place. And she understands that robo-debt will stand forever as one of the worst policy failures by any Australian government. A deliberate policy to hound Australians, not an accident, not a mistake, one that was accompanied by threats in this chamber to hunt people down, And we know that it made an enormous difference to so many Australians who were the most vulnerable. And we know as well that in this chamber it was raised day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. Those opposite knew that it was an illegal scheme, but it didn't stop them still pursuing some of the most vulnerable people in our society. A shocking abuse of trust that was exposed by the Royal Commission. People like Melanie Cleave told the Royal Commission, she said this, "I had to sell everything I could sell just a little to get by. I had to go to the Salvation Army for the first time ever in my life, and it was quite degrading. It made me feel like I was a criminal. I never want to deal with Centrelink ever again." This is the pathology of those opposite. The party of robo-debt, cutting the humans out of human services and replacing them with a system that sent people notices and threats for debts which they did not owe, ripping the social justice out of social services. The same ideology that produced robo-debt still drives them today. The Leader of the Opposition has nothing positive to offer Australia. No plan, no solutions to the challenges facing the country, just saying no and opposing change. We know that many people out there are doing it tough, which is why we have the cost of living relief, including cheaper medicines, has saved $200 million on 17 million scripts in the first 10 months of this year. We've invested in affordable housing, including for women and children escaping domestic violence. We legislated energy bill relief for 5 million households. We invested in fee-free TAFE after a decade of cuts and neglects. To all of those measures they opposed, those opposite continue to show a total disregard for people who are doing it tough. Just punishment, blame and vindictiveness. They never miss an opportunity to stand in the way of supporting those people who are the most vulnerable.
Has concluded. Give the call to the member for Calais.
To the Prime Minister. Tomorrow, Eugowra and the communities of the Central West will mark the first anniversary of the awful storm and flood tragedy of the 13th and 14th of November 2022. While our communities are grateful for the $100 million joint state and federal funding package, which was finally announced last week, we need assurances that this funding will be made available to residents on the ground on the double. Prime Minister, will you give our communities this assurance?
Call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Clare for his question. I certainly will give his community, through the member for Clare, that assurance, and I thank him for the representations that he's made on behalf of that community, and for the fact that I was able to visit that community in Eugowra along with the then Premier, Dominic Perrottet, as well. And we've worked through with the Minns government in New South Wales support for the Central West region, and we have promised through the Central West Recovery and Resilience Package, jointly funded by the Commonwealth and New South Wales governments. It's comprised of $32 million for the Regional Transport Resilience Fund, $25 million for the Community Assets Program, $1 million for legal aid assistance, $2 million for the Central West Housing Consultation Program, and we have in principle agreement as well, in addition to that, for $40 million for the Central West Housing Program. Now, this funding is to help the New South Wales Central West region's recovery from these devastating floods, but also, importantly, to build resilience for the future. I remember sitting in rooms some years ago before the former Labor government changed the rules, where you weren't allowed to build back better, and that makes no sense at all. It makes sense to actually take into account when a natural disaster occurs, and that's why we have that funding for the Regional Transport Resilience Fund, is aimed at how do we build roads that don't just get washed away and therefore isolate communities in the future. This package includes support for the repair and replacement of critical community assets, improving the resilience of public infrastructure, as well as legal assistance. We've also got that in principle support to match funding for a resilient housing program for the Central West. Now, these are important projects which will be overseen by a forum of community leaders and reps from both Commonwealth and state governments. And I know that the Mayor there is a fine fellow, and he will be involved as well. We are prioritising the most impacted local government areas of Cabone, Parks, Forbes and Lachlan. I know this impacts on the member for Riverina's electorate as well, and I thank him for the representation that he's made. My government is determined to make sure that people aren't left behind in those communities, and that's why we've acted in partnership with the New South Wales government.
The call to the honourable member for Paterson.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. The Nixon report found our migration system was broken, allowing the exploitation of some of the most vulnerable people in our society. What progress has the Albanese Labor government made in addressing these issues after a wasted decade?
Give a call to the Minister for Home Affairs and the Minister for Cyber Security.
Thank you so much, Speaker, and could I thank the member for Paterson for her question, and she's absolutely right. What we saw is a decade of profound mismanagement of our migration system, and the consequence of that is that some incredibly vulnerable people were very, very badly hurt. Now, Speaker, the Nixon report was received by the government, and it made very damning findings about the migration compliance system that was set up and overseen by the Leader of the Opposition when he was in this portfolio. We have seen enormous damage result from the poor management of this system, and the member for Paterson, I know, is particularly concerned about violence and abuse that's perpetrated against women. And the Nixon report makes it very clear that women were predominantly the victims of the conduct that was uncovered. We saw horrible instances of violence. We saw awful instances of human trafficking. We saw awful examples of sexual abuse. And all of this was facilitated by a broken migration system that was broken by the Leader of the Opposition. Now, Speaker, we take a very different approach to the management of this system. We set rules and we make sure that people follow those rules. And the work that the Minister for Immigration and I are doing is imperative. We are assiduously and diligently working through all of the broken aspects of this system and fixing them piece by piece. Now, a really important part of the government's efforts is Operation Inglenook, Speaker, which is an Australian Border Force-led task force which is working around the clock to track down the criminals who have come in across the borders under those opposite and bringing them to justice. In fact, just weeks after Operation Inglenook was stood up, the leader of a syndicate who was running brothels and his wife fled the country. They fled the country because they knew about the new approach the government was taking, and I can tell the parliament that when they left the country, what we did was cancel their visas and give them a lifetime ban of ever coming back into our country again. Speaker, Inglenook is absolutely essential, and the fact that we had to set it up really demonstrates how poorly this system was being handled. Speaker, we have completely redesigned the work that is done within the Home Affairs Department, and I want to draw the Parliament's attention to one really important fact, which is that under those opposite, immigration compliance officers in our department were cut in half. Cut in half, Speaker. What did they think was going to happen? When you pull resources out of the department, when you pull resources out of ABF, what you find is the borders don't get properly managed. Now, Speaker, we take a very different approach. We're proud of the success that's been done to date, but there is still a hell of a lot more work for us to do.
The call to the honourable member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Analysis of OECD data issued last week shows that under the Albanese Labor government, Australians have experienced a bigger collapse in living standards than any other advanced country. Why are Australians paying the price for a distracted Prime Minister failing to focus on the real issues affecting Australians?
Order. The call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the Shadow Treasurer for his question, which I'm not sure in what capacity he's asked me, given I'm representing. Given I'm now, but I'm now representing the Treasurer.
Order.
So I just thought I might do him a favour.
Order. Members on my left. The member for Gippsland. Order. There is far too much noise. The member for Hume was heard in silence. Order. The member for Hume has asked his question. Order. The same courtesy be shown to the Prime Minister. He has the call.
I thought, Mr Speaker, it might be an opportunity for him to get his numbers up of a question to the Treasurer. That's all, and it was a missed opportunity, Mr Speaker. Just a missed opportunity.
Order. Order.
Mr Speaker, what we have done, I've already spoken about the jobs that we have created. Let's compare how our economy, I'm asked about international comparisons of our economy and how it's going. The member for Latrobe is
now warned.
Well, our unemployment rate is 3.6, lower than what we inherited. Our participation rate is 66.7, higher than what we inherited. Our gender pay gap is 13, lower than what we inherited. Women employed full-time, 3.8 million, higher than what we inherited. Manufacturing jobs, 948,000, higher than what we inherited. Long-term unemployed, 108,000, lower than what we inherited. And industrial disputes, 10,200, days lost over the quarter up to June, lower than what we inherited. That is the position that we have presided over, and indeed something that will be of interest to the former Energy Minister. The wholesale electricity prices in September quarter, $63 compared with $264 compared. And so we are, of course, the other figure that the Shadow Treasurer won't want to hear is the $22 billion surplus that we produced, as opposed to the $78 billion under those opposite.
Cease rejecting.
And they asked questions about that, of the new RBA governor.
Order.
And this is what she had to say at the estimates just a couple of weeks ago. What we're observing is that we're being assisted by the fact that the government has taken the cyclical benefits of the budget and banked them. She went on to say, I think that's very positive. For us, if it was being spent, that might be an issue, but it's not being spent, it's being banked. So I think that's very helpful. I actually think what they're doing at the moment is good. That was in response to questions from the ever-helpful Senator Hume. Senator Hume, who complains sometimes that the Senate actually sits. But that was the question from Senator Hume going forward, and that was the response of the RBA governor.
Order. I'll hear from the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. After a decade of neglect and cuts to Medicare, how is the Albanese Labor government working to ensure that Australians have access to more bulk-billed GP appointments and cheaper medicines?
The call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank my friend and electoral neighbour, the member for Boothby, for her question. She had a long career in healthcare before coming to this place, and she campaigned very hard in Adelaide on a promise to her community to strengthen Medicare. And as a member of this government, she is delivering on that promise in spades through our three-point plan to strengthen Medicare, to triple the bulk billing incentive, to roll out a network of Medicare urgent care clinics, bulk-billed clinics, including one in her electorate in Boothby, and, of course, Mr Speaker, to make medicines cheaper. The week before last, the member for Boothby joined me at the Castle Medical Centre in Edwardstown in her electorate to announce almost $6 billion of new investments in Medicare that took effect on the 1st of November, including, of course, the tripling of the bulk billing incentive, the largest investment in bulk billing in the 40-year history of Medicare. Dr Ng told us that 80% of the patients at her centre were either kids, pensioners or concession card holders covered by these new incentives. So from November 1st, Mr Speaker, a bulk-billed standard consult at that centre goes up a whopping 34% for all of those patients. 34%. The increase is even higher in regional Australia, Mr Speaker, with that standard consult going up by as much as 50%. And this is on top of the largest across-the-board increase to the Medicare rebate that also took effect that day in more than 30 years, since Paul Keating was the Prime Minister. A bigger increase this year alone than those opposite managed in 6 long years in government. We're already receiving reports, Mr Speaker, of practices returning to bulk billing or reaffirming their commitment to stick with bulk billing if they were reconsidering it. The College of General Practice, of course, called this investment a game changer, and it could not be more different, Mr Speaker, to the approach from those opposite, particularly the approach from their leader, a health minister who said, it must be remembered, that in his view there were too many free Medicare services, a health minister who tried to abolish bulk billing altogether and make every single patient pay a fee every single time they visited a doctor, every child, every pensioner, every concession card holder. Well, for Labor, Mr Speaker, bulk billing is the beating heart of Medicare. Our historic investment is a huge boost in funding and confidence to the beleaguered general practice sector that was so neglected by the former government. But most importantly, Mr Speaker, it will make it easier and it will make it more affordable for millions of Australians to see their doctor.
The call to the give the call to order. The member for Riverina will just cease that immediately. Give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Before the last election, the Prime Minister promised real wage increases. But analysis of OECD data shows that in the first 12 months of his government, Australian workers have suffered a 5.1% decline in real incomes, the worst in the developed world. Yet again, the Prime Minister has misled the people. Why are Australians paying the price for a distracted Prime Minister failing to focus on the real issues affecting Australians?
Give the call Order to the Prime Minister.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for her question, notwithstanding the ironic nature of it, because the previous government, of which she was a minister for some of the time and some of the time not, had a deliberate policy of driving down wages. That was their deliberate policy. That was part of their economic architecture.
Order. The Leader of the Nationals.
Economic architecture, deliberate design. So they might have forgotten. They might have forgotten a point in the election campaign where I was asked whether I would welcome a $1 increase in the minimum wage, a $1 increase, and I said absolutely. And for days afterwards, those opposite railed about how this would destroy the economy. This would bring everything down. And they thought that was the basis of an election campaign that was held. But not only has that happened once, of course, there's been since then another case in which, once again, there was a significant increase in the minimum wage, something that is very important going forward. Now, in terms of wages as well, we on this side of the House are very proud that for aged care workers, in response to the Aged Care Royal Commission, we have had a 15% wage increase.
The member for Hume.
For nurses, those people who look after our older Australians and give them the dignity and respect that they deserve. Now, did those opposite, when they received the Royal Commission, do that? No, didn't do it. Didn't do it because they just regarded it as just not a priority. We on this side of the House, also have our closing loopholes
Prime
bill.
Minister will pause. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will state the point of order.
Point of order on relevance, Mr Speaker. How can it be in order for the Prime Minister to
Resume
refer
your
to a
seat.
previous government when the question—
Well, the Prime Minister was asked about election commitments and real wages and about whether he has delivered on those commitments. Just get the Prime Minister to return to the question.
Mr Speaker, I'm talking about wages.
Order.
And we have for minimum workers,
the member for Hume.
up nearly $3 an hour is what we have done. On July 1, 2.4 million workers on awards got a 5.75% pay rise, the largest increase since 2009. But there's legislation before the parliament to stop loopholes, to stop people working side by side, but of course they won't support that because they wouldn't even take action about wage theft. Would not take action about wage theft when they were in government.
Concluded. Before I call the member for Bennelong, there's far too much noise. The member for Casey and the member for Fadden are now warned. The call to the member for Bennelong.
My question is to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. What has been the response to the ongoing consultation on the government's closing loopholes legislation? What obstacles does the government face in closing these loopholes that allow workers to keep being underpaid?
Give the call to the Minister for Employment, Workplace Relations and Minister for the House. The member for Lawler will not interject before a minister speaks. The minister has the call.
Thanks, Speaker, and I thank the member for Bennelong for the question. Someone who's been operating very constructively with the Closing Loopholes Bill. I know you're on the list to speak on it later today. Contrast that constructive way of engaging with the Manager of Opposition Business, who earlier today organised a filibuster on his own amendment to prevent it from coming to a vote. Now, I've not seen that before, but that's what we had today, to prevent his own amendment from coming to a vote. But that same constructive way of engaging that I've referred to for the member for Bennelong has been how a whole lot of the employer groups have been engaging as well. And I want to pay tribute to the work of the Australian Hotels Association. And I know the member for Bennelong will have many casuals employed by hotels and organisations that are members of the Hotels Association in the electorate of Bennelong. Well, what did Stephen Ferguson have to say? The amendments provide much more certainty and fairness for workers and employers and can be chalked up as a win for both. They strike the right balance. But the Hotels Association isn't the only one that's been engaging positively with the government. I've got to say, and the Health Minister I think will agree with me, we don't often get the Pharmacy Guild turning up to Labor Party branch meetings. But the Pharmacy Guild has seen the common sense of the amendments that have been negotiated with respect to casuals and have said the following. The Pharmacy Guild of Australia supports the Albanese government's decision to amend the Closing Loopholes Bill in the interests of both casual employees and employers. Those opposite have voted consistently and are doing so again today to delay any provision that is about people being underpaid. Any provision that's about people being underpaid. They want to say, they hide behind, oh, we're just wanting to advance the ones about safety. If that was true, why are they not trying to advance the clauses about industrial manslaughter? Is that somehow nothing to do with safety? Do they not understand that labour hire workers are far much less likely on a mine site to speak up about safety issues than people who are directly employed? This government will not say to workers who are being underpaid that their concern is somehow not so controversial, it's a second-rate concern and it's something that we would vote for to delay. We're not going to say to gig workers, you can just wait as long as possible before you have any minimum rates. We're not going to say to the families of people who've died at work that, oh, we'll just delay into the never-never industrial manslaughter. We're not going to say to people who are having their wages deliberately stolen by the employer that it's somehow not urgent or it's too controversial to make wage theft a crime. To the casuals who are working as though they're permanents and just want security, this government will not cause them to delay.
Give the call to the Leader of the Nationals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, in the past 12 months, sheep prices across the nation have plummeted by up to 70%. Industry confidence has collapsed and farmers are being forced to the wall as a result of the government's announcement to shut down the live sheep export industry. Did the government undertake any economic modelling on the impact of banning live sheep exports?
There's far too much noise on my right. I'm just going to ask the Leader of the Nationals to state that question, and the member for Fremantle will cease interjecting. I want to make it clear, beginning of question time this week, no one is to interject during a question. The Leader of the Nationals has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, in the past 12 months, sheep prices across the nation have plummeted by up to 70%. Industry confidence has collapsed and farmers are being forced to the wall as a result of the government's announcement to shut down the live sheep export industry. Did the government undertake any economic modelling on the impact of banning live sheep exports before announcing the shutdown?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The contradiction in the Leader of the National Party's question is that he's saying that a foreshadowed policy that hasn't happened has had this massive impact. Because it's not about... Because it's not about...
Prime Minister will pause. The Leader of the Nationals made it clear to the House that he'd be heard in silence and gave him a good go by getting the second reading the question. I'd ask the courtesy to be respected to the Prime Minister. Order. The Prime Minister has the call.
Because price, of course, doesn't go to investment. It's about future. And what we have done is say that we will respond to this in a considered and an orderly way. We appointed a 4-person independent panel to consult with farmers, communities, supply chain participants to do all of this, to inform when and how this policy could be implemented. That's why we've very clearly not put a date on when the phase-out will occur. Order. We've said we'll consult with industry in the interests of a strong and sustainable future for the Australian sheep, wool and sheep meat industry. And that's one of the things that we've been doing as well. It must be said, is to negotiate on behalf of with our trading nations in order to open up further our exports.
Order. Call to the honourable member for McEwen.
My question is the Minister for Social Services. How is the Albanese Labor government working for Australian families to help with the cost of living pressure by providing real and immediate support to families, including through the Social Security safety net?
The call to the Minister for Social Services.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for McEwen for his question and for his strong advocacy for so many families and pensioners in his electorate. Of course, our government knows many families are feeling cost of living pressures, and that's why the Albanese Labor government is delivering $23 billion in cost of living relief to make things easier, including by strengthening our social security safety net. In my portfolio alone, we are helping families by increasing the maximum rate of rent assistance, expanding the single-parent payment and increasing paid parental leave. At the same time, we've lifted the base rate of many working-age and student payments to provide extra support for those doing it tough. We are providing direct and tangible support to hundreds of thousands of families and pensioners in different settings and different circumstances. And this support is flowing into household budgets now. We have delivered the biggest increase in rent assistance in more than 30 years for around 1.1 million households, including pensioners and families who receive family tax benefit. Now, that's more money to help cover the cost of rent. Now, for many families, more rent assistance complements the extra support we're delivering through electricity bill relief, cheaper childcare, cheaper medicines and investment in bulk billing. For single parents who face the difficult challenge of balancing work and care on their own, we've extended the eligibility for single-parent payment until their youngest child turns 14. This will result in an extra 65,000 single parents being better off by, on average, $170 per fortnight. Now, for the parents of newborns, the government is delivering the biggest investment in paid parental leave since it was introduced in 2011. We've expanded access to more families, including introducing a $350,000 family income limit, and made it much easier for both parents to share care. And from 2024, we will expand the scheme by an extra 6 weeks, reaching 6 months by 2026. That's over $5,000 extra to help cover time off around the birth of a baby and help juggle work and care. Not only will our investments help families, but it will help participation and productivity, so there is a dividend to the Australian economy as well. Myself and my colleagues in this Labor government are working across government every day to deliver cost of living relief, including through the measures I've outlined. And we will continue to work for Australian families to deliver for them now and into the future.
Call to the Leader of the Australian Greens.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Over 11,000 civilians have been killed in the bombing and invasion of Gaza, including over 4,000 children. The government says it's concerned by the number of deaths, but clearly not enough to stop backing the invasion. Prime Minister, what is the number of deaths, and how many more children must die before Labor will join France and most of the world in calling for a ceasefire?
Call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Melbourne for his question. We have said very clearly that Israel does have a right to defend itself. We have also said that the way that it does matters, and we must distinguish between Hamas and Palestinian citizens. And we have said the same thing consistently. I have said the same thing to President Herzog, to Prime Minister Netanyahu and to the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, who I spoke with last week. I have said very clearly that every Israeli and every Palestinian life matters. Everyone. Every child, every baby, every innocent civilian. And I say with respect to the member for Melbourne that during this debate it does not assist to suggest that somehow the government, or indeed any individual, unless you have some basis for it, is dismissive of the loss of life of people in Gaza or in Israel. I have met with the Islamic leadership of this country from right around the country. I've met with Jewish community leaders. This is a really difficult time, really difficult. And community cohesion matters. And the attempt to somehow say that Australia is engaged in on-the-ground action almost with some of the comments that you would read is just not accurate and is not appropriate in my view. We have said that we want humanitarian pauses as a necessary first step. We've said that any step on a path to ceasefire can't be one-sided. Hamas is still bombing Israel, it's still using human shields, and it's still holding more than 200 hostages. I've said really consistently that Hamas has contempt for international law. They're a terrorist organisation. But Israel, as a democratic nation, has a responsibility to uphold international law and protect innocent lives, and to protect civilians, including children. It's a message I give here. It's a message I give when I've spoken to leaders in those countries as well.
Call to the honourable member for Parramatta.
My question is to the Minister for Communications. The Optus network outage last week affected millions of Australians and businesses. What support is available for Australians impacted, and what steps will the Albanese Labor government take in response to the recent outage?
The call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Last week's Optus network outage impacted some 10 million Australian consumers and businesses across mobile, broadband and fixed-line services, underscoring just how essential connectivity is for all Australians. The impacts were felt across the economy and the community, with repercussions for EFTPOS systems, hospitals and public transport, and consumers and business customers were understandably frustrated. It was not just an inconvenience. For some small businesses, it represented a whole day's trade, and for Australians with a disability, including those relying on internet-assisted technology, the outage would have been deeply distressing. The Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman is available to provide support to consumers and small businesses who are impacted if direct engagement with Optus does not result in a satisfactory outcome. The TIO has useful and clear information on its website that is specifically relevant to this outage. The ACCC also offers information about relevant rights under consumer law. I encourage all members to visit accc.gov.au and tio.com.au and share these important materials with their constituents. Australians expect and deserve better from their communications service providers, and it is essential that we understand what happened, what went wrong, and what improvements can be made by the sector as a whole, in order to reduce the risks of a future disruption of this scale reoccurring by any major telecommunications provider. That is why, Mr Speaker, I have tasked my department to establish a post-incident review. My department is currently working on the terms of reference, and the government will make further announcements in due course. This will include an examination of issues such as the adequacy of regulatory settings to support access to 000 emergency services, amongst other important matters. Importantly, Mr Speaker, independently, the regulator, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, has also announced that it has commenced an investigation into Optus's compliance with rules requiring emergency calls to be successfully carried from each telecommunications provider to the emergency call person, who is Telstra. Our government will carefully consider recommendations from the upcoming reviews to ensure the regulatory and policy settings adapt and respond so as to keep Australians safe and reliably connected.
The call to the honourable member for Wannon.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. Under the Albanese Labor government, the decision to release 80 hardcore criminals will result in more violent crimes against Australians. Why hasn't this government drafted any legislation to keep Australians safe from these criminals?
Order. Give the call. The Minister for Home Affairs and Cybersecurity will cease objecting. Give the call to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the Shadow Minister for his question. Perhaps I can begin by reminding him and all members that on last Wednesday afternoon, the High Court handed down a decision which required the release of an individual from immigration detention. The High Court handed down a decision which we, of course, are complying with. I would say, as any government would, but as we've heard earlier, not every Australian government has complied with the requirements of the law nor respected separation of powers. Can I say this too, Speaker? The Commonwealth argued against the decision ultimately that the High Court maintained. But of course we were prepared, as I think the Shadow Minister's question suggests, we were prepared for this outcome because of the significance of this case. Members would appreciate that the case has overturned a precedent of nearly 2 decades. Throughout this, community safety has been our #1 concern. And I say to the Australian community, it will continue to be our #1 concern. I hope that that is a concern that is echoed across this chamber and in the other place. To that end, the Australian Federal Police and, of course, the Australian Border Force have been working closely with our state and territory authorities. I might make very clear that that cooperation through the ABF commenced prior to the decision being handed down in recognition of our apprehension of the seriousness of an adverse decision to the Commonwealth. We took those steps in advance of it. We also established a joint operation with state and federal.
Order. The Minister will pause and I'll hear from the member for Wannon.
Speaker, on relevance, the question was why hasn't the government—
Order. Resume your seat. Order. The member for McEwen will cease objecting.
Here, I wait 18 months for a question.
The Minister has the call and will be relevant to the question.
This is not serious. This is not serious, and this is a serious issue. We moved quickly to ensure that we issued visas to impacted individuals with appropriate conditions to ensure that community safety can be upheld, including requirements to report regularly to the department to inform the minister of any changes of personal details, address, social media profiles, restrictions of industries on employment and a range of other strict conditions. This is in addition to state and territory requirements which go to the issues that you were talking about, Shadow Minister. Now, we have been required to release people almost instantly. That is the decision of the court. But we continue to consider all measures that may be available to strengthen our protection of the community. And I note, of course, that we are yet to have the reasons for the court's decision. We have been approaching this issue in anticipation of a decision because we regard community safety seriously. We continue to do so, unlike members opposite whose record in this area is an unmitigated disaster.
Give the call to the member for McNamara.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Cybersecurity.
Following the cyber attack on DP World last week, how is the Albanese government taking action to uplift the cyber security of Australia's critical infrastructure?
Give the call to the Minister for Home Affairs and the Minister for Cybersecurity.
Thank you so much, Speaker. In my role as Minister for Cybersecurity, I'm not always able to get up and deliver positive news to the Parliament, but we do have good news today. This afternoon, DP World announced that they are resuming operations at their facilities. Their expectation is that 5,000 containers will leave their ports today. Speaker, the incident at DP World is the latest in a string of cyber attacks which have shaken our country. And this is why this is such a central priority for our government. The DP World incident also, Speaker, shows that some of the critical reforms that our government has put in place in the past 18 months are actually working. Speaker, for many Australians, they're probably not really conscious of the tremendous complexity that's involved in managing a cyber incident of this size. In the case of DP World, we have a company here that manages 40% of freight movements in and out of our country. The implications for a shutdown, even briefly, on the ports are very widespread, affecting most of the parts of the Australian economy. Speaker, in the instance of this particular cyber attack, we had the National Cybersecurity Coordinator who was on the ground effectively immediately working with the company and across industries to help manage the impacts of this. The National Coordination Mechanism, which was triggered for the first time by our government in the context of the Optus attack, has been meeting daily to manage the impacts of this serious incident. And they've been able to also coordinate the Australian Cybersecurity Centre in its engagement with the company and the Australian Federal Police. Now, Speaker, it's really important for the Parliament to understand that none of these mechanisms would have been possible without the reforms of our government and under the former government. But, Speaker, we're not satisfied with clearing what has been an impossibly low bar set by those opposite in cybersecurity. Let's remember, Speaker, that they didn't even have a cybersecurity minister. I mean, let's pause on that point for a moment. We've dealt with a lot of cyber incidents in the last 18 months. They didn't even have a minister who was clearly in charge of these issues. Now, Speaker, we have implemented enormous reform in the 18 months that we've been in government. We have declared 168 critical infrastructure assets of systems of national significance. We've commenced a very substantial, very important set of national cyber exercises which help us flex and build that muscle. And indeed, Speaker, today the government made 2 announcements about policy reforms that will be contained in the forthcoming National Cybersecurity Strategy. One of those is to introduce mandatory reporting requirements for ransomware attacks around Australia, and the second is to lift the requirements that we place on telecommunications companies to make sure that those telcos that can do so much to affect the cybersecurity of every citizen in our country are meeting their responsibilities. Speaker, we've got a big mess to clean up here, but there's lots of work underway, and I'm proud of the work that's been done so far.
Give the call to the honourable member for Fowler. Give the call to the member for Fowler.
Thank you, Speaker. Prime Minister, families are paying over $2 per litre at the pump today, which is increasing costs and inflation across the supply chain. It's one of the reasons interest rates has increased, which is hurting working Australians immensely. Fuel prices will go up and down, but a cut to fuel excise would lower costs and reduce inflation now. Why won't the government reduce the fuel excise at a time it has a budget surplus and provide instant cost of living and mortgage relief to families, especially in Western Sydney?
Call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Fowler for her question, and I certainly acknowledge that so many people, including in her electorate, are doing it tough at the moment, and as a result of a range of factors, not the least of which is what has happened with oil, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also we know that the Middle East crisis.
Order. Members on my left. The member for O'Connor.
That the Middle East crisis, which is being undertaken at...
Order. Members on my left. The member for O'Connor is warned, and if he interjects one more time, he'll leave the chamber. Prime Minister will be heard in silence.
We inherited, of course, when we came to office, a decision of the former government they put in their budget in March of 2022 that they had a limited time of a pause on fuel indexation. They put that limited period on there because when it comes to the issue of petrol indexation, one of the concerns that is there in the economy, and including from the Reserve Bank, that feeds into interest rates, is how much cash there is in the economy as well. So we have purposefully targeted cost of living relief through the increase in payments, which the Minister for Social Services spoke about earlier today. From the Minister for Health,
the member for Casey
has spoken about today with cheaper medicines and the bulk billing tripling of the incentive. We have very consciously targeted the relief at families through childcare relief as well. So we will always look at measures to—
The Prime Minister will pause. There's far too much noise. The member for Fowler, on a point of the Prime Minister's concluded his answer. Order. The member for Moreton has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Following the Prime Minister's visit to China and attendance at the Pacific Islands Forum, what are some of the outcomes of these engagements that will make a positive difference for Australia's economy and security?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Moreton for his question, and we know that the world is confronting serious challenges and economic headwinds, and that what happens internationally matters at home. And crucial that Australia takes our seat at the table and speaks up for our interests. That's how we get results for Australians. We know that for jobs, for trade, for the economy and security, it matters, that engagement. And that's why I was pleased to be the first Australian PM to visit China since 2016. This is one of our most important relationships. More than 1 in 4 of Australia's export dollars derives from the relationship with China. And indeed, more than 1 in 4 of Australia's jobs depend upon trade. We have been patient, calibrated and deliberate in our approach to this relationship, and it's already paying dividends. Removing of trade impediments on timber, coal, barley, hay and a range of other products. A path forward for wine exports from Australia. Between January and August this year, and there's been a huge bump since then, Australia exported $6 billion of the products that had impediments placed on them to China. If we compare that, it was $85 million in the same period last year. $85 million up to $6 billion. And it's no wonder the National Party are so pleased about this as well, because it's had a particular impact in regional Australia. When I was in Port Lincoln, they were already signing deals on barley, and barley is already in China from Australia, making a difference. And the wine industry, of course, has had bumper crops that is sitting there waiting to be exported, and already there are negotiations on deal there. And I look forward to the removal of any of the impediments across the board. Now, the visit to the Cook Islands was also important that we engage with our Pacific neighbours. We know what happened with security arrangements during the last government. Well, our government has reached out and ensured that we are involved in securing peace and stability in the region. And the bilateral agreement, as a result of Tuvalu's approach, the Philippine Union, is a Tuvaluan word for the traditional values of good neighbourliness, care and mutual respect. It's a bilateral treaty that will come before this parliament, dealing with climate change, including disaster assistance and coastal adaptation, special mobility pathway to enable an initial cap of 280 people per year, but importantly as well, security agreement, a mutual agreement on any arrangement or engagement with any other state or entity on security and defence-related matters in Tuvalu. Very important for Australia's security